Okay, welcome everybody to a very, very full house here at the library. Unfortunately, we're pretty much at capacity, so we're not going to be able to take in any more chairs due to fire code. Try to squeeze in where you can, I guess. So hello everyone, and thank you for being here this morning. I'm Jamie Herman, the Adult Programming Manager here at Princeton Public Library. It's my great pleasure to welcome everyone to our community room for the annual Kenneth and Audrey Gould lecture. And so to kick things off, I'm going to invite Audrey Gould to come on up to the microphone to say a few words about the lecture series.
Thank you and welcome everybody. I'll just give you a little brief history of the Gould lecture. When my husband, Dr. Kenneth Gould, passed away, our two daughters, Ellen Gould Baber and Georgia Gould Moss, wanted to establish a fitting memorial to him and the years that he taught at the medical school. And so they came upon this idea of a lecture series, both here and at Bellevue, where he went to school, and at the Child Health Institute, which is part of the Robert Wood Johnson Medical School. So there are 3 lectures that occur each year in those 3 places. So we hope you enjoy this afternoon's lecture, and welcome to everybody.
Thank you, Audrey. So yes, Kenneth Gould was a Princeton-based psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, and he was a strong believer in lifelong learning and a desire to perpetuate learning in others. So this lecture series as well as also was started in 2014, and it continues to this day, not only in Dr. Gould's but also as a testament to all that Audrey Gould and her daughters and the rest of the family have given to this library over many, many years. So thank you, Audrey. You've been of great service to our community and to this library. I'd also like to thank Princeton University Press for their ongoing support of this lecture series, and Labyrinth Books for being here today for the book signing portion of the event. We will have question and answer after the talk, and we'll bring around a microphone. And please remember to silence your cell phones. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce the speaker for today's Gould lecture, Peter Singer, born in Melbourne, Australia, and educated at the University of Melbourne and the University of Oxford. After teaching in England, the United States, and Australia, he has, since 1999, been Ira W. DeCamp Professor of Bioethics in the University Center for Human Values here at Princeton University. He has been called one of the world's most influential, and at times controversial, philosophers. He helped launch the animal rights and effective altruism movements and contributed to the development of bioethics. He first became well known internationally after the publication of Animal Liberation in 1975. Some of his other well-known books are Practical Ethics, The Expanding Circle, How Are We to Live, Pushing Time Away, The Life You Can Save, and Why Vegan? In 2012, he was made a Companion of the Order of Australia, the nation's highest civic honor. He founded the charity, The Life You Can Save, and is a co-founding editor of the Journal of Controversial Ideas. In 2021, he was awarded the Berggruen Prize for Philosophy and Culture. Today we are here to hear about ethics in the real world, 90 essays on things that matter. Singer shows that he's also a master at dissecting important current events in a few hundred words in these essays. It's an updated and expanded edition of the book, which was originally published in 2016 and was released this year by Princeton University Press. So please join me in welcoming Peter Singer.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be speaking to such a full house on a Sunday morning. And of course I want to thank Audrey Gould for her remarks and for everybody involved in endowing and setting up this lecture. So I am going to talk to you about ethics in the real world. As you've just heard, it has 90 lectures. I can't obviously touch on all of them, but I will say a bit about some of them. And if you do buy the book, I actually recommend that you read it in small pieces. Otherwise, it's a little bit like eating finger food for your dinner. It's going to be a little too much. So take it in small doses. I think it works quite well. Good. So let's start off with this photo, which is actually related to the first essay in the book. This photo is known as the pale blue dot. It's the most, I believe still the most distant photo taken of our planet from the Voyager spacecraft as it was exiting the solar system. And it was suggested by Carl Sagan to NASA that should take a photo of the Earth from there. And I suppose the point is, it's in one sense the insignificance of our planet against this vast background. The light, by the way, is apparently just a band of sunlight that was across the camera, but there's this vast void. Actually, NASA slightly enhanced the image of our planet to make it stand out a little more visibly. But that's on which everything that you've ever heard of, everyone you've ever known, every historical figure that you've ever read about, all the lives of prehistoric people have also occurred here, everything that matters, and it's all on that little blue dot. So that's, in a sense, a way of grasping the insignificance of our place in the universe, but also thinking about, as Carl Sagan says, the importance of actually looking after this home to us and to all of us, and the only home that we have, and Elon Musk notwithstanding, the only home in which it seems we are going to be able to sustain life for quite some time to come. So where do we go from that opening? I want to talk a little bit about the basis of morality. The first section of the book is called Big Questions. So our place in the universe is clearly one big question. And the nature of objective truth, since I work in ethics, obviously that's an important and interesting question. So I have an essay that greeted the work On What Matters, volume 1 of it, by Derek Parfit. Derek Parfit was, I think, the closest person that I have met, certainly in philosophy, who I would regard as a genius. Somebody who, whatever argument or point you wanted to develop, he could already think of 3 objections before you could, and then he could think of how you might reply to each of those objections and how he would respond to those replies, a little bit like an amateur playing chess with a grandmaster. But that's a photo of Derek when he was young. There's a lot of photos of him when he was much older and his hair had all turned white. And but that's how I remember him when I came to Oxford as a graduate student in 1969 and first heard him speak at a class. And by the way, I'm sure Princeton University Press would like me to mention that they've produced an excellent biography of him by David Edmonds that is available. So Parfit wrote about many different issues in ethics, but in his later years he was occupied, some would say obsessed, with the question of the objectivity of morality. And he took the view that unless there are moral truths, objective moral truths, then his whole life was pointless, because his whole life had been about understanding morality, exploring morality, recommending some moral views, or producing arguments for them against others. And if there was nothing objective about this, then he thought nihilism was the only alternative, basically the view that nothing matters. So his major work, which there are actually 3 volumes, the last volume published sadly posthumously after his death in 2017, argue about for the view that there is objectivity in morality. And this I just liked as a key idea. He thinks that just as some mathematical truths are self-evident, so also some ethical truths are self-evident. And his example is avoiding agony. So it's self-evident to us when we experience agony that it's a bad thing, that it would be better if we were not experiencing it. That seems obvious. The more controversial step, perhaps, is to move from caring about not experiencing agony yourself to the idea that the fact that anyone, or even any sentient being, is experiencing agony is itself a reason why you should try to prevent that or to end the agony if it's occurring. Now, Parfit's not saying it's a conclusive reason. You may have other reasons of your own, but it is a reason, and that's enough for him, he thinks, to get some kind of objective foundation to ethics. So I've actually been persuaded by Parfit, not by the book, but some years earlier, and Tom Nagel, another philosopher, that is a defensible view to take. When I started out my career in ethics, I was not an objectivist. I was more influenced by ideas that were around in the 60s and 70s, that in ethics we can issue prescriptions, and the prescriptions have to be in some way, have some universalizable features. That goes back to Kant's categorical imperative. But still within that there was a range of things that we might choose and no objective reasons for choosing one or the other. I've come to hold a more objectivist view of ethics since then. Okay, let me talk about some of the ethical issues that I have worked on, and of course which I therefore write about, written about them in academic publications, in books, in articles and journals, but also in more popular articles, and those are the ones in the book. So one of the things that I'm well known for is my argument that given that there is extreme poverty in the world, currently, according to the World Bank, there's something around 700 million people living on the purchasing power equivalent of $2.15 US per day. And given that there are also more than 1 billion people living at a level of affluence which is really unknown in prior centuries, well, maybe in the 20th century, but certainly not in centuries prior to that, the question is what ought we to be doing about this? What are our obligations? And I've argued that indeed, if we want to be living an ethical life, we can't ignore this. We can't restrict our ethics to the idea that I'm going to not harm others, going to follow moral rules that prevent me harming, maiming, killing, cheating, stealing, all of those thou shalt not kind of rules. I think that's not enough given the situation that we are in. And I've argued for that. This is one of my early academic articles in Famine, Affluence and Morality, first published in 1972, but quite often reprinted, in which I asked the readers to imagine that they're walking past a pond in a park, could be any of the ponds around here, but you know that it's a shallow pond, so you know that you could jump into the pond and stand up anywhere in it, but you notice that a small child has fallen into the pond and the child is too small to stand and appears to be in danger of drowning. Your first reaction, I suppose, would be to say, who's looking after this child? There's got to be parents or a babysitter or somebody looking after such a small child. But although you can't explain why, there just doesn't seem to be any other adult around except you. So what do? Your next thought, I hope, would be, I'd better jump into the pond and save the child. But suppose you had a less noble thought, and that was, unfortunately today you've put on some really nice clothing because you're going somewhere important, it's quite expensive, it's going to get ruined if you jump into the shallow pond. Do you really have to save the child? Do you really have to do that? Would it be wrong not to? Well, I hope you're all thinking, yes, it would be wrong not to. I think it would be wrong not to. Very seriously wrong to put your shoes or other clothing above the life of a child who you can easily save at no risk to you. But of course, the relevance of the little story is, aren't we all in that situation? Aren't we all buying things we don't really need when the money that we're spending on them could be used to save a child, not a child in front of us, but a child somewhere in the world who would otherwise die perhaps of preventable causes like diarrhea, lack of sanitation, malaria, or a whole range of different causes. And even if it's not just saving lives, helping people to live a minimally decent life when otherwise they can't. So that's what I've argued. These are figures from UNICEF. There's around 5 million children under 5 died last year. Most of them were preventable deaths, and that's close to 14,000 deaths per day. It doesn't hit the headlines in the way that currently what's happening in Gaza hits the headlines, but it's going on. Each death is a tragedy for the child, for the parents, for families, and it is preventable. So if you think it would be wrong not to save the child in the pond, isn't it wrong not to do something significant for these children? Unfortunately, there are things we can do. There are effective charities which can make the most from your donations. So another issue that I write about in the book is what's known as the effective altruism movement. And this is one of the founders of it, Toby Ord, who I first met when he was still a graduate student. I think it was 2007 perhaps. And he had read that article, Famine, Affluence and Morality, as many philosophy students do, and thought about how much good can I do if I live modestly for the rest of my life and give the surplus of my earnings to the most effective charity I can find. So he predicted, correctly at least so far, that he would become an academic. And in the United Kingdom, where he was, the salaries of academics are more predictable than here, because they're government universities. So he predicted that he would advance through the ranks, eventually becoming a professor, and how much he would earn until the retirement age. There's also a compulsory retirement age in the United Kingdom, which I think is 67. So he predicted how much he would earn. Then he added a couple of £1,000 to his graduate student scholarship to give himself a little more comfort than he had at the time, and deducted that from what he would have each year and added up what he would have to donate. And then he looked around for a reasonably substantial sum, as you can imagine, but nothing like what a billionaire would have, of course. Then he looked around for the most effective thing that he could do with it. And he found huge differences in the effectiveness of different charities. And he wasn't talking about those that are actually fraudulent. There's a very small number of charities that basically are paying large salaries to the people who run them and not doing anything very much for anyone else. But I think we can put them aside. The major charities that you would have heard of are not in that situation. So what can you do? Well, here's one example that he looked at. Providing guide dogs for people who are blind, visually impaired. Now, that's actually quite an expensive way to help people, because the guide dogs have to be trained by skilled people who of course have to be paid a salary for doing so, and the person who is going to be aided by the dog has to be trained to work with the dog as well. So with all of the money that he could save up, he could only help 50 people to get a guide dog. But by donating to an organisation treating trachoma, the major cause of preventable blindness in low-income countries, he could save 80,000 people from becoming blind. And presumably not becoming blind is an even bigger benefit than having a guide dog when you are blind. So that's an illustration of the huge differences that you can get from what is a good charity in itself, but a less cost-effective way of helping people than something else. And typically, as with this example, it's in the low-income countries that you get much better value for money, because there are all kinds of untreated conditions which can be treated quite cheaply, and which, if somebody had them in the United States or another affluent country, would get treated, but are not treated in low-income countries. So that's some of the effective charities are doing that. Another effective way of helping people, and specifically of saving lives, is the Against Malaria Foundation, which is an organisation that distributes bed nets to people in malaria-prone regions. That's what's in the blue bags that the children are carrying. And they save lives. Sorry, the line has got a bit squashed at the bottom. It's $4,500 the estimated costs. Of course, the bed nets themselves are very cheap, but you have to give out a lot of bed nets to be statistically confident that you will have saved a life. And that's based on careful trials and comparisons with other areas, similar areas where bed nets were not distributed. So that's a reasonably reliable figure, I think. Okay, so $4,500, it's not nothing, but it's certainly very cheap compared to what it costs to save a life. Here, if somebody goes into intensive care, you're talking about very rapidly running up bills in the high tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, and in some cases, millions. It's also interesting to compare it. I have another essay in the book on the high cost of art, and it's interesting to compare it with that. So here's an example you might remember of the painting Salvator Mundi, the Saviour of the World, which was attributed, some people would say discovered, to be by Leonardo da Vinci, and there's some discussion about that, or whether he had some hand in it but didn't paint at all, whatever. Anyway, it sold at Christie's for $450 million, which makes an easy mathematical calculation with the 4,500. Instead of buying that painting, the successful bidder could have saved 100,000 lives. While these cultural treasures are something that is certainly valuable, I'm not saying that we shouldn't spend anything on preserving the cultural heritage of our species. We should, but the prices that things are sold for at auction, I think, are really on the high side, you could say, with things that are also extremely valuable, perhaps difficult to compare those differences, but I think in the world in which we're living, art at the high end is certainly greatly overvalued. Okay, I'll move on to a different issue. There's a few essays about climate change. What is our responsibility living in one of the countries that has no longer the highest, greatest quantity of emissions? That has gone to China, but of course China's population is more than 4 times that of the United States. So we do have a very high per capita rate of emissions, and we are living at a very comfortable level. So I think that we have a huge responsibility to get to net zero emissions as rapidly as possible. Princeton University has set 2045 as a date. I was on a committee that helped to advocate for that. I certainly hope that the university will achieve it, because the university obviously has the resources to achieve it very comfortably. But I hope it's really important that the United States, and in fact the whole world, achieves net zero greenhouse gas emissions by something pretty close to that date. We've seen that climate change has accelerated faster than anybody would have expected. We've heard the impassioned speech of Greta Thunberg speaking for a younger generation, and essentially blaming us, looking around the room. I think most of you are a generation that is old enough to be blamed for having left the world in this state, even though we knew, certainly back by the 1980s, that emitting greenhouse gases was really a very dangerous practice in terms of the future of the planet. I also have a number of essays on the treatment of animals, and particularly I focus on factory farmed animals, because that's the largest scale suffering that we inflict on non-human animals. We're talking about globally something like 200 billion vertebrate animals raised for food. I'm not talking about wild caught fish, though I am including so-called aquaculture, factory farmed fish. So 200 billion animals, which obviously dwarfs the entire human population, is also about 1,000 times larger than the number of animals used in research. That's also another quite large area of animal use. But this seems to me to be the one that we really ought to be trying to put an end to if we possibly can. And as I note here, it's pleasing that, so what you're seeing here are stalls for the mother pigs, the sows. They are basically breeding machines. They live in these stalls whenever they're pregnant, and they're pregnant most of their lives. because that's their purpose. Once the number of piglets per litter starts to fall away, they're sent to be slaughtered. And as you can see, the stalls are too narrow for them even to turn around and do more than shuffle half a step forward or backwards. And that's all that these intelligent and sensitive animals have to do all day. Now, as I say down the bottom, I'm very pleased that New Jersey in July banned sow stalls, though there's a phase-out period, so they're still around. And I don't exactly remember what the phase-out time is. And a few other states, including California as the largest, have also banned them. But there's 35 states that have not, and they include Iowa, Nebraska, North Carolina, basically the pig producing states of this country. If we're continuing to eat pork products, pig products, we are continuing to support this way of confining the mothers, and I won't show you a slide of the offspring. They're also extremely crowded and kept indoors, and that's the way in which the overwhelming majority of pigs are produced in the United States and indeed in most of the world today. Then there's egg production. This also was in part of the same legislation that went through here, but again, most US eggs come from birds who are still kept like this in small wire cages, extremely crowded. They can't stretch their wings fully, the cage is too small, and they're constantly rubbing up against other birds in the cage. So unless you get the pasture-raised eggs, which do exist, there are also cage-free eggs, but cage-free simply still means that they're inside, they're just not in cages. They do have more space, they can spread their wings, but they're still very crowded. So I think if you really want ethical eggs, you have to find the cage-free ones. Whole Earth has them down Nassau Street. If you want to try there, you are going to pay more than you do for these caged eggs, of course, but that's, again, I think, something that we ought to be doing. And what New Jersey has not banned, and in fact no state in the United States has banned, is this, which is intensive chicken production. I come across people now and again who say, oh, I don't eat red meat, which probably means that they're eating more chicken. And from an animal welfare point of view, it's better from a climate change point of view, perhaps, because cows emit a lot of methane. From an animal welfare point of view, it's considerably worse. It's worse partly because chickens are smaller and there's more of them that you will be eating than if you were eating pieces of a cow, but also because they are extremely crowded and they are bred to grow extremely fast. So this quote at the bottom from John Webster, who's a veterinarian and a founder of a Centre for the Study of Farmed Animal Welfare, says it's the single most severe systematic example of man's inhumanity to another sentient animal. That's not only because of the crowding, it's also because they are bred to grow so fast that they put on weight at an enormous rate. One of the reasons why chicken is cheap now is it doesn't take very long to grow a bird to market weight. It's about 6 or 7 weeks that they're sold at market. It used to be at least twice as long before they achieved that weight. What's the problem with that? Well, one problem is that their legs are still immature. Their leg bones have not really matured and hardened properly, and yet they have to bear this enormous weight of the bird. So Webster says that it's like forcing somebody with arthritis in their legs to stand up all day. Now you might ask, well, why are they standing up then? Why don't they sit down? There's a reason for that too. You can't see it here because they're so crowded, but they're on what's called litter, which could be wood shavings or something like that. But it hasn't been cleaned out. So each flock of hens is about 9 weeks. It hasn't been cleaned out for months or even more than a year. So all of the bird droppings of the previous birds have accumulated on that litter. And bird droppings are alkaline. So when combined with moisture, if you have a warm shed, you have a bird with some moisture on the skin, sits on the alkaline droppings, it actually gets a caustic burn on its thighs and chest. So it's uncomfortable for it to sit down, for the birds to sit down either. But that's all part of this enormous mass production process, with obviously no attention whatsoever to the welfare of individual birds. If a bird's legs collapse under her and she can't get to water, these lines you see down there are bringing food and water to the birds. She can't move to get to that. She's just going to die of thirst or starvation. Nobody is going to notice that one of these 20,000 birds is unable to move. Eventually, maybe they'll collect the corpse, but that's all that will happen. All right, let me move on to a different topic, because I do want to make sure that we have some time for questions. One of the things that I have said that has been controversial, and if some of you remember when I came to Princeton in 1999, there was some controversy about that. There were some protests. Steve Forbes, who was a member of the Board of Trustees, and his father was a donor for Forbes College, was then running for the Republican nomination for president. I think he was somewhat embarrassed that he had not, as a member of the Board of Trustees, objected to my appointment because of my views on abortion and euthanasia. So he then announced that he would cease to donate to Princeton University as long as I was there. I'm told that that's a pledge that he's actually broken, but I don't have first-hand details about it. But obviously it was necessary for him to do something if he was to get any chance at the Republican nomination, which George W. Bush beat him for anyway. So what you're seeing here is an anencephalic infant. I think you can see on the photo that basically the top of the head above the eyes is absent. Some anencephalics actually do have more of a skull, but it's just filled with fluid. So an anencephalic has no cortex. It does have a brain stem, so this is not a brain-dead infant. This is an infant who is legally alive, but will never be a conscious being. Will never smile at her mother or anything of that kind. Now, this is mostly picked up in utero during prenatal diagnosis, but of course some women or couples will not terminate the pregnancy, and so the infant is then born. And again, then usually a decision is made not to treat the infant, and the infant will die usually within days of birth. But again, although most Christian religions say you don't have an obligation to treat such an infant, some religious people do, and they can actually live. Certainly read of one case in Virginia of an anencephalic who lived for around 2 years. So I've argued that although this is undeniably a living human being, that does not mean that an anencephalic life is one that is valuable or worth living. And I don't think there's an obligation to keep an anencephalic alive. But also there was a case in Florida a few years ago where a woman had an anencephalic baby and asked the doctors if some good could come of the organs in her child. Now, an infant heart available for transplant actually can often save an infant's life, because there are infants who are born with heart defects, and there are very, very few organs available of the right size to transplant to an infant. But the hospital said, no, we can't take a heart out of a living human being. The family went to a court, and the judge said exactly the same. And I find it incongruous that there is no objection to taking the heart out of a baboon, for example, and that kind of research has been done in this country, and transplanting it, although a baboon is clearly a far more aware animal, more autonomous being, more sentient being than an anencephalic infant. So that's one of the views that obviously some people do not agree with, because it is a challenge to the traditional ethic of the sanctity of human life. And I also support assisted dying or voluntary euthanasia. Partly that I think it's something that the state ought not to be interfering with, in accordance with this principle from John Stuart Mill's famous essay on liberty, when he says, the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. I don't actually support everything Mills says there, because I do think we're justified in requiring seat belts to be worn when driving a car, or helmets to be worn when riding a motorbike. But I certainly think in this case, the state should not be interfering with the considered decisions of a terminally ill, or even incurably ill, I would say, patient and their doctor, as occurs when there is no legal provision for medically assisted dying or voluntary euthanasia. This is an issue that I've been involved with for quite a long time, going back to the 1970s. And it's one on which I'm pleased to say there has been quite significant progress made. Either medical aid in dying or voluntary euthanasia. The difference is in voluntary euthanasia, the doctor can give you a lethal injection on request. In medically assisted dying, all they can do is prescribe a drug, which if you drink it, will you'll fall asleep and not recover, not wake up. So both of those are now lawful in the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and somewhat surprisingly, Colombia. But medical aid in dying has spread much more widely and exists now in almost all of Australia, in Austria, Canada, New Zealand, Portugal, Spain, and Switzerland, and in the US in a number of states, Oregon, Washington, Montana, Vermont, California, etc. And also, again, fairly recently, New Jersey. Which is interesting, and an interesting court challenge was amended to the section of the law in Oregon which said you have to be a resident of the state. And the court actually upheld the challenge, and in Oregon now you don't have to be a resident. And I think there's one or two other states where that is likely to change, or maybe the same principle will apply, will be upheld by courts elsewhere. So you could say that anyone in the United States can now, if they're well enough to travel to Oregon or another state, can get medical assistance in dying, which is quite a significant change. Okay, let's move to another large question. Does life have a meaning is something that I've talked about. And if you're not religious, as I am not, then of course we have to ask that question in the context of understanding that we have simply evolved here, that life has evolved here of a process of billions of years, that there is no preordained plan or purpose behind it. And in what sense then can life have a meaning? Well, it can't have a meaning overall for everybody, but we are beings who can give meaning to our own life. And I think there are important things to be said about how to do that, that fit with some of the ethical points that I made before. So let's ask what makes for a meaningful or successful life. Is it buying all of these products? Well, I think the answer is no to that, and I have some, not just my opinion, but I have some psychological research that supports that, that says that if you think that you're going to be happy by buying a lot of expensive consumer goods, you will briefly get some happiness for it, but it won't last very long, and then you will have to keep going to do more of it. So basically, you're on a treadmill because your past consumption means that you have to keep moving ahead to return to previous levels of happiness or well-being. Whereas, on the other hand, I think working for a cause that you feel is really making a difference to the world does not have that effect. So, as I mentioned, I talk about effective charities in my book and in essays in the life, essays in ethics in the real world. But I also wrote a book called The Life You Can Save. The first edition came out in 2009. What you see here is the 2019 10th anniversary edition. So after the book came out, I set up a website to try to also promote the ideas and get people to pledge to assist people in extreme poverty. And I got a phone call out of the blue from this guy, Charlie Bresler, who told me that he'd had a successful career in retailing men's clothing. He was actually the president of one of the nationwide men's clothing chains. And he made quite a reasonable amount of money doing that, but he somehow felt this was never what he really wanted to do with his life, to dress men better than they would otherwise dress themselves. He'd read my book and he was impressed by it, and he thought more people ought to know about this. You ought to have an organisation, a charity, that promotes these ideas and that lists the charities, because in the book I recommend some charities, that lists the most effective charities that people can give to. So I said, fine, if you've got the time to set it up, go ahead, basically. Well, I said slightly more than that. I'll assist you and guide you with it, but I just don't have the time as a professor at Princeton to really be very hands-on in that. And Charlie went ahead and did that. He did it on negative salary, if you're worried about people in charities being paid too much. He not only took no salary, but he was a major donor to the organisation. So that's why I tell him he had to pay to work. But it's been fairly successful. The organisation's not a large one. You probably haven't heard of it, so that shows that it hasn't been as successful as it should have been. But it has led, I think the current figure is something close to 100 million, maybe somewhere 80, 90 million dollars being given to the effective charities we recommend. It has got curated this list of effective charities, and if you want to read that book, you don't have to buy it. Not that I wanted to deter you for a moment from buying Ethics in the Real World, of course, but you can download it as an ebook or an audio book free from that web address, thelifeyoucansave.org, where you can also find out more about the organisation. And that's because the organisation bought back the copyright from Random House in order to precisely do that, and so it has been quite widely distributed. Okay, here's somebody going back to the animal movement, somebody I want to pay tribute to. Henry Spearer, I think, was the most effective animal activist of the last quarter of the 20th century. And he was somebody who'd always worked for people who were oppressed and underprivileged. He'd marched in the civil rights movement in the South. He'd worked in the merchant marine and joined a rebel faction of the National Maritime Union, because that was a corrupt union that was doing sweetheart deals with the boss to the bosses to sell off the workers. But he read, actually not the book Animal Liberation, but an article that was published in the New York Review of Books a couple of years earlier, and came to a class, an adult education continuing ed class that I was running at NYU, and decided that animals were an oppressed group that merited his help. So in 1997, Henry was diagnosed with an incurable form of cancer, and I had said that I wanted to write about his tactics and how he was so successful in the animal movement. And I did video for a few days. I stayed in his apartment and videoed interviews with him. And this was one of the things he said about, I think I asked a question like, you don't seem terribly disturbed by the fact that you know that you don't have very long to live. And he said, this is what he said, I guess basically one wants to feel that one's life has amounted to more than just consuming products and generating garbage. One likes to look back and think that one's done the best one can to make this a better place for others. It's not a sense of duty, but rather this is what I want to do. I feel best when I'm doing it well. Okay, I think I'm out of time and I need to close on that point. So thanks very much for listening, and do we have some time for questions? Yeah. Okay.
So I'm not going to be able to get through all of the crowd here very well, so I'll just kind of take a few questions from the front of the room here. We've got one person.
Thank you very much for a nice talk. I want to go back to some of the slides you showed in the early part of the children who are hungry, and of course they're heartrending pictures and we all want to help them. But as you know, during our lifetime, the population of the world has increased by a factor of 3, to the point where now humans and their domestic animals make up 96% of the total mass of mammals on the planet. And there are some ecologists who estimate that a sustainable population of the whole of the world would be of the order of 2 to 3 billion people, not 8 or 9. So I'm looking at these kids and wondering now, if we help them, are they not just going to make another generation that will then suffer during an ecological collapse of either the climate or biodiversity or the nitrogen cycle, all of these ills that we're becoming more and more conscious of, but that are just not sustainable in the long term. So how do you balance the kind of immediate reaction to try to help people in a bad way to the knowledge that we are heading to an unsustainable future with potential for a catastrophic population collapse?
Thank you. So that figure about the 96% biomass is, of course, as you correctly said, including our domesticated animals. And the cows in particular, but also there's a lot of chickens, although they don't have so much bird mass, don't have so much biomass, is taking up a large part of that. So if we stopped eating the animals and ate the plants directly, which incidentally is a more efficient way of feeding ourselves than growing plants and feeding them to animals, we would dramatically reduce that biomass and we would improve the sustainability of our existence on the planet. That's the first point. The second point is that it's really now only in sub-Saharan Africa that population is growing rapidly. In many places it's falling, starting to fall, falling in Europe, falling in places like Japan, and it's predicted to fall quite dramatically in China. There was an article in the New York Times by Dean Spears a few months ago, and he was suggesting that in fact it will be declining world population that will be the problem after 2080. He thinks that that's when world population is now predicted by some, though not all demographers, to peak. Now, of course, if it continues to grow to 2080, and we still have fairly rapidly population growth in sub-Saharan Africa, that is a problem. I don't deny that it's a problem. But I hope that we can do something about that. And one of the ways we can do something about that is by educating girls, because there's good evidence that the more years of schooling a girl has, the lower her lifetime fertility will be. So one of the charities that the Life You Can Save recommends is a charity specifically called Educate Girls, and there's a second educational charity on that list as well. So I think those are the best ways that we can act if we are concerned about, as I say, I think it's regional population growth that is more of a concern than global population growth now. But if we are concerned about that, then there are things that we can do about it.
You opened the lecture by showing 1 + 1 = 2, and then you showed Carl Sagan's blue dot. Then what follows that you showed us, I think by Parafit, about the experience of agony is an obligation or something like that. I couldn't follow, to avoid agony in the future. It seems to me that between the two there's a tension. I do not know why that. Are you advocating that there is a tension, or we ought to overcome that, or there is really no tension between the two? Could you explain that?
Between the mathematical statement and
No, between Sagan's blue dot
Oh, I see. Between
and the agony we will experience.
I don't think there is a tension. No, I mean, I know that some people would say, well, the fact that we're just a dot in this vast universe suggests that somehow, it's all meaningless, it's all pointless. But I don't think so. And I think, we know that our life will be worse if we experience prolonged agony. And I think we can say the same about any sentient being that experiences prolonged agony. And I think that makes a difference, if you like, into, whether the universe has gone well or badly. Now, of course, there are billions of galaxies and billions of stars in each galaxy. There probably are sentient beings in other places, though we don't know about them. And it may be that it makes a very tiny difference, but that's all that we can do. We can't act on a larger scale. So I still think doing what we can to avoid agony, to avoid suffering, and to promote pleasure and happiness where we can are worthwhile things to do.
Thank you, Professor Singer. I have a question that is undoubtedly based on an overly simplistic understanding of something you discussed having to do with effective charities. But my question to you is, if to be an ethical person, we should select those charities that can, for example, save lives, why would any ethical person want to give money to the library or to a museum or to a symphony?
Well, you might think that the library, for example, will put on talks and promote books in which people can spread these ideas. So, I got a similar question when I spoke a while ago about, and my host was somebody working for National Public Radio, right? And she asked me, why would you donate to NPR when you could save lives? But exactly, NPR was also spreading some worthwhile ideas in ways that some of the more commercial media in this country don't. So I think those institutions are very worthwhile. But some of the others, I have to say, I would not donate to Princeton University. They have an endowment of $34 billion. I think that's enough. I think they can manage quite well. And I would not donate to the Metropolitan Museum in New York either for similar reasons. I think that we need to be selective in what we're doing, but it doesn't mean that we only need to save lives immediately.
Okay, and our last question.
You've spoken about objective morality, that's the whole point. My concern is a selective objective reality, and you didn't want to walk into the trap of the Gaza-Israel conflict, but you did mention it. And what I fear and just so uncomfortable with is the unwillingness to hear a whole story, and I'm not saying which, actually all participants are doing that. And yet it's out of a complete objective morality that you can find ways to resolve differences. Could you comment about the completeness, necessity of completeness, if that's your thought also?
I think we certainly need to be able to understand a variety of different viewpoints. And there's a real danger, not only between Hamas and Israel, obviously, where things have got to a horrendous situation, but also within the United States about not listening to people with different views. So I've always tried in my courses to avoid that. For example, I've stated what my views are on abortion, but I have frequently invited a Christian theologian and philosopher, Charles Camosi, who thinks that there's a right to life from conception, to address my class so that people can understand his views and consider them. And I think it's important that we do that to try to get that complete picture. But of course it's difficult to do, and sometimes it goes back to more fundamental worldviews, including religious ones, which may be almost impossible to actually alter. I'm hopeful that we can, in the long run, still educate people to take a more evidence-based view of the world, and that will enable us to resolve more disputes. But I admit that the signs are not always good in that respect.
Okay, thank you. I think we have about run out of time. So we were talking just before the lecture, Professor Singer and I think this will be one of your final lectures here in Princeton, it sounds like.
Yes, I'm leaving Princeton at the end of this semester. I've decided to say I'm retiring from Princeton. I'm going to be not retiring from life. I'm planning to do more writing and speaking elsewhere, but probably not in this particular part of the world so much. Though I will be back for a farewell conference in May. But apart from that, yes, you got me more or less in time before I leave.
So I feel very fortunate. So thank you. Audrey Gould was the one that very much wanted you to come here to do this lecture. So Audrey, you must have had a good sense of this being the perfect way to have the lecture resume after this pandemic time. And we're so honored to have had you here for a very thought-provoking and thoughtful talk. And we have Labyrinth books here for signing, so I'm going to have Dr. Singer go over to the table. And it's a very full room, so try to kind of keep the signing line maybe up the middle a little bit, and just have a little bit of patience. And we will get on with that right now. So let's have a round of applause, please. Thank you so much.